I'd like to start by welcoming all of you to the IEEE Press webinar. This is our first webinar, so we're excited to have you all here with us. And in this webinar, you'll hear from our expert panelists who will discuss insights from their book, Developing the Innovative Technical Organization and How to Implement a Systems Approach to Strategy. Note that for the duration of this webinar, your phone line will remain muted. And if you have any technical difficulties, you can always contact us at IEEE@ieee.org. You can, of course, also reach out to WebEx directly through their technical support line. We will have a Q&A session at the end after the presenters are done presenting, and you can ask questions through the WebEx chat. We'll try to address as many questions as possible, but if we do run out of time, we'll try to provide you with a response at a later point. Do note, of course, that the webinar will be recorded and the content will be made available after the recording for attendees who can't join us live. On the next slide, I just wanted to iterate how to go about the asking questions. So when you log in, you'll see the toolbar at the bottom. All you have to do is launch the chat feature. When you do ask questions, put them in the chat box for everyone. You can either do that or choose panelists, but we'll see them and we'll be monitoring the chat. So if a question comes in, we can pull it up. And with that, what I would like to do is welcome our first speaker for the day, Dr. Ron Luman, to get us started.
Okay, thank you, Vaishali, for inviting us to this webinar. And thanks to everyone who's joining in here this morning. 5 of our 6 co-authors are online today, with Ann Cadia being under the weather. Each of us will be presenting a segment that together will give an overview of the book's core content and insights that we believe are applicable to a wide range of strategy practitioners at all experience levels. And by way of introduction, the core systems approach and lessons learned that you'll see here today were first published in IEEE's Engineering Management Review in 2023. That title of that piece was called Becoming a Strategy-Driven Technology Organization. That article is available online with open access, but it focused relatively narrowly on the particular strategy implementation and results at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory. This book expands and supplements it with new material on research and broadens the orientation from a case study towards a guidebook for organizations trying to realize a new, bold, and compelling vision centered on innovation. We have just 16 slides to cover, so we should have plenty of time for the Q&A that Vaishali has already described. Next slide, please. We were thrilled that Admiral Jim Stavridis agreed to review the manuscript and subsequently write the foreword to the book. Jim is a renowned strategist who served as the NATO Supreme Allied Commander and is currently most visible as a principal analyst on CNN with regard to the conflict in the Middle East. He's on almost daily. Based on his strategic perspective and deep knowledge of the Applied Physics Lab, he identified 3 key focus areas of the book that he commends widely to the readership. Number 1 is implementing an effective strategy. That is so challenging, actually, that research shows that nearly half of strategic plans actually fail in the implementation phase. And we might cover more of that a little bit later today. And also, the next is fostering innovation across a full and mature enterprise. That is, innovation is not just an elite activity confined to inventors, but it's something that all staff members can do that contribute to the success of the organization. And thirdly, the book serves as a practical primer. We call it a guidebook for strategy-driven innovation, with straightforward methods, lessons learned, and chapter by chapter probing questions to assist you, the strategy practitioner, to move your organization ahead. Next, please. So during the editorial review by the book series, the IEEE Press Book Series Advisory Board, which I have to say was very rigorous, they suggested that we add some background material on APL, since many readers may not have heard of APL nor be familiar with the nonprofit R&D sector. Indeed, since our founding in 1942 during World War II, we mostly kept a low profile, often earning the name a stealth laboratory. But prior to this innovation called the VT, variable time proximity fuse, it was needed to counter accelerating threats such as Japanese kamikaze aircraft in the Pacific. At that time, before this fuse, it took naval gunfire approximately 500 shells per hit. And soon after deployment of that fuse, which goes into anti-aircraft shells, this was reduced to just two down from 500. This innovation, which we call our first, quote, defining innovation, has been lauded by World War II historians as among the top 3 Allied innovations credited with winning the war, alongside the atomic bomb and large-scale radar for air defense. The fuse's now declassified name was actually more descriptive as a, quote, radio proximity fuse, since its key innovation was to include a miniature radar on the front end of anti-aircraft shells. The innovation included utilizing vacuum tube technology to survive over 20,000 Gs of acceleration and a spin rate of 30,000 RPM. And originally intended to be dissolved after the war, right after the war, as many of these laboratories that were set up to mobilize the engineering and scientific expertise across the nation for the war effort, the Navy requested APL to continue and focus on new challenges as the Cold War emerged. And yes, you see the picture there, a used car garage. APL actually, due to wartime urgency and secrecy, deep secrecy, the effort was indeed begun in a used car garage. It's kind of interesting backdrops. Next slide, please. So just what is APL today? APL has evolved to be a large-scale R&D laboratory with a diversity of projects and sponsors. Mission-wise and business-wise, it sits as a bridge between government and industry. On the first panel there, you see that. It's a research division of Johns Hopkins University, not an academic division. It's called a university-affiliated research center that has certain guidelines. For example, operating guidelines. For example, to maintain independence and objectivity, APL, like others in that ecosystem, does not compete for contracts intended for industry and has to maintain certain core competencies that are not readily available in industry. In short, our work is oriented towards making fieldable, one-of-a-kind systems that can be eventually transitioned to industry for production purposes. Sponsors, as you see in the third panel there, are almost exclusively government, with major entities listed there. And all accepted work is measured against a standard derived from the core purpose, which is make critical contributions to critical challenges. That's a high bar, and we take it very seriously. You can see down at the bottom banner, it gives you an idea of the profile, the scale of our operation, and that orientation towards prototypes is reflected in that staff makeup, which has about 21% of the technical staff at the doctorate level and the rest at the bachelor's and master's level. There's more information about APL's history from a strategic perspective and the overall federally funded R&D sector is in the book's 2 appendices. And with this current diversity of sponsors and scale of staff, facilities, we really aren't a still repository anymore. We're widely known, but it started out that way. Next slide. No, this slide. This is good. So who's the book meant for? It's meant for executives and leaders in technical organizations ready to drive their organization to the next level through innovation. As I mentioned, it's a guidebook with APL's experience and lessons learned provided as an embedded case history. We envision it as a text also for graduate level courses in strategy, perhaps in MBA or engineering management master's programs. We feel it's applicable, the content's applicable to all 3 general sectors: a corporate, that is for profit, nonprofit, as is APL, and government. And while that model is widely applicable, you will see that the lessons learned that you'll see a little bit later, they are a little more specialized to technical workforce organizations. So we are not as broad with the lessons learned because that's experience driven. You see two premises there on this slide. And the first is that organizations benefit from becoming strategy driven. What do we mean by that? We mean that you have an integrated strategy development and execution at the same time. As I mentioned, most strategies die in the execution phase. That is, I'll be specific, 50% of these strategy efforts, whether the strategy is good or bad, they do not make at least 50% of their objectives after the first 5 years. So that's called failure by an independent consulting organization. Also, to be strategy driven, you have to make the strategy foundational to the organization's planning and execution cycle, and communicate strategy as visible and meaningful to decision making at all levels of the organization. Strategy should have consequences for resource allocation, executive accountability, and innovation incentives. And the premise two is that if you focus carefully on infusing innovation into the organization, that causes a cultural change that can raise the organization to a new level of results and success. These are not particularly new insights, as you can see from the quote there from Mankins and Steele, which is 20 years old from 2005. And it just really, there's a virtuous cycle that happens as you embark on this strategy driven approach. And I think that with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tim Galpin to describe the integrated strategy system and how to develop a long-range vision for your organization.
Well, hello. The integrated strategy system is the practical implementation of the systems approach that Ron described for you generically. And I'd just like to take a few minutes to walk through this diagram, which really captures the entire process. So you can see, I'm sorry, there's an echo. Can everybody mute, please? You can see the outside of the diagram is about infusing innovation. I'm going to leave that alone for now because we're going to come back to talking about innovation at a later point in the briefing. I want you to focus first in the center of the diagram, which is the classic long-range vision framework. Again, I'm going to describe how to do that, but the important thing about the long-range vision is that it's going to have to marry where you think, as you're developing your strategy, where you think as an organization you are now, that's a historical and a cultural context, to where you see your vision going. And so what's long range? We chose 25 years. There are certainly companies out there, they're Japanese companies that have this idea that they can have 100-year strategies. We do think you have a fundamentally different approach if you push out that far as opposed to something that is tractable. APL happened to have a centennial coming up at about the 25-year mark, and that was the basis of our long-range vision. But we set that framework. Then what I really want to concentrate here on this slide are the quadrants. And in the upper half are really decisions made at the institutional level, the corporate level, and the lower half are really actions taken by whichever team your organization puts in charge of resource allocation and reviewing the strategy implementation. For us, there was a core group of executives. It was myself as the chief strategy officer, the chief of staff who was speaking more or less for the technical staff, the chief technology officer who was invested in innovation and the technology base of the laboratory, as well as the chief financial officer for obvious resource allocation reasons. Now, if you look in the upper right-hand quadrant, this integrated strategy system begins then, if you have that baseline of the long-range strategy, with putting a short-term strategy in a very concise an actionable format. In fact, you want one page. We'll show you our format in a bit, but you want one page. And the key thing about these actionable strategy actions that are going to be taken is that they have to be measurable. So why do they have to be actionable and measurable? Because the next step is going to be align the resources with that strategy. And this is really crucial. If you're not going to align your resources, the strategy is paper tiger. You know, it doesn't have any teeth. Well, I suppose you could put other implementation metrics in there. I mean, you could align executive compensation, for example, to the strategy. But if you really want the particular strategies to be successful, you know, in their detail, then they have to be resourced. And if you're going to resource them, then you have a far better chance of actually measuring the output relative to the resources that you put into them. But that comes to the third quadrant, which is the regular portfolio reviews. We did them twice a year, but they had two characteristics. The first was to measure the investments that you made into the particular strategies. And so we reviewed all of the particular initiatives that were launched as a result of the strategies. And the second is to look at the portfolio of the institution as a whole. So, you know, for us, we were talking about perhaps 5,000 to 6,000 different projects happening at any one time across the enterprise. Obviously, the strategy team didn't look at all of those, but what we did do is we examined the implementation down to the next level business units. We called them mission areas. And then we evaluated how they implemented at their level and whether or not they were actually taking concrete steps to realign their portfolio with the strategy. So let me just make this practical for just for an example. Let's say all the way back in the upper right-hand quadrant, there was a decision made to move the organization from pure research and development and additive manufacturing to a fabrication or industrial scale implementation for a particular purpose. Well, that might then require going from benchtop additive manufacturing machines to entire facilities and multi-million-dollar capital investments into the product. Or similarly, if the institution made a decision to move towards ASIC design and its developmental capabilities, that might mean an HR decision to hire more ASIC design engineers and the licensing go from an academic license to a manufacturing license for ASIC design to build out integrated circuits for whatever purpose you might have. So just as a practical matter, these things have to be closely coupled. And then finally, if we go to the upper left-hand quadrant, then the point here is if you're in let's say it's a 3-year cycle, because our short-term strategies were 3-year cycles, you're very likely to have things that occur within that 3-year cycle that require new decisions to be made. And they might reallocate resources. They might not have to reallocate resources. And just a practical example here might be what happened to all of us when, for example, COVID struck. And decisions had to be made on how to continue to implement work as you're fundamentally changing the work environment. So we had a strategic decision agenda that occurred on an annual basis that allowed us to be adaptable within the context of the overall short-term strategy. And those decisions would then get folded in the next year into that one-page strategy that we were all trying to execute. Next slide, please. So I told you that we would come back to building the long-range strategy. So this is the core of that integrated strategy system. Now, we chose to rely, and this was perhaps almost 20 years ago now, implemented about 15 years ago when we finally came up with the overall system. We chose to rely on the system that was outlined in Built to Last, which is a book by Collins and Porras. But you don't have to use this particular approach. This is just the approach we did. I would like you to understand, though, that the approach should have the same basic underpinnings, which is to look back to what the organization is all about. And that might require an assessment of where you are today, and then look to the future, because the key outcome is identifying the envisioned future where you want to be. And, I explained to why we were at 25 years. Other than that seemed to be a tractable time frame for us, and to create this big, hairy, audacious goal, which, by the way, is a term of art by Collins and Horace. But it just means your long-term vision, challenging long-term vision that you can define and describe in what we call the vivid description. If you have those two elements, then you have the basis, and it has to be a relatively concise, 1 to 2 page document. That we actually ended up defining our core purpose, values, and that vivid description all within 1 page. So, you can really get it down if you need to. Why? Why so concise? Because if you write a 20-page strategy, people aren't going to actually be able to take that and make it useful. But you can write a 20-page strategy if you want to, but you have to then distill that 20-page strategy down to something that looks like 1 page so that you can implement it, just as a practical matter, so that you can implement it. And if you do that, then and you've thought that through at the strategic level, then you can push it down through the organization. Now, we'll come back later in this briefing about how to do broad engagement with the staff. But what I mean by pushing it down into the organization is something simpler than that. If you at the institutional level are trying to define your strategy, then you have to be able to figure out how that means something to each of the component parts of your enterprise. And so that when you push down into the organization, people will be able to see themselves in that long-term strategy, even if they don't see the specific thing they're working on day to day in that strategy. And in terms of innovation, which we'll talk about soon, that really means seeing the innovation in all they do. Now, moving beyond this long-term vision, which is that the core of the integrated strategy system, could we move to the next slide, please? We have this 3 to 5 year look. Now, this is a format that we use. It was vision, strategic focus, execution priorities, also called VSE. What I would say here is that this format is not required, but I think a 1-page strategy where you're very clear about where you're going in the next 3 or perhaps 5 years, 3 to 5 would be reasonable. We put those goals under the strategic focus, and then each of them had a 1-year strategy, and we revised this document every year to have a 1-year execution priority that was going to drive the resource allocations for that 3-year implementation. So let's break this down a little bit. So the long-range vision is what we just talked about on the previous goal. And I'll give you an example. Of course, this is in the book, but for APL, we decided our historical character was being innovative. And then we thought perhaps, we had lost our way as we were coming into the 21st century. So we set our long-range vision to be to create defining innovations to ensure the nation's preeminence in the 21st century. Ambitious, but very straightforward. And what it really meant, though, was that when we wrote our strategic focus elements, our constituent business units then had to think about how they could potentially be the ones driving a given defining innovation. They could define it for themselves. And that if everybody was trying to accomplish that, then we had a chance to actually create defining innovations in a broad sense across the board. Now, this is a pretty high bar that we set for them, because these things are only known retrospectively, typically 10 to 15 years later. And so we weren't asking them to prove that they had created one in this 3 to 5 year window, or certainly not within the 1-year window, just that they were taking concrete steps towards that goal that we could measure. So in the strategic focus, 3-year planning periods, right, driven by that strategy. And then we emphasized the things that need to be done in a very practical sense over those 3 years to be able to get us there. And then that, as I said previously, provided the basis for driving our investments. Then on the 1-year execution priorities, they always had to correspond, and they had to be measurable, because we were going to come back and we were going to measure them twice a year. And the basis for the annual investment, we would start there, but we would adjust as we went along, depending on whether or not we needed to reinforce, or we thought that perhaps we were able to execute without the continuing internal investment. So, for example, if we were successful and it was picked up as a funded program by one of our sponsors or customers, we might then be able to cut back on the internal investment. So let me give you a very practical example that I can pull the string on later in the briefing. We might say APL had to adjust at one point around 2015 to deal with the failure of our business model at the time on winning NASA proposals. And so after some soul searching, we actually created a new strategic focus that we injected into the strategy at the time, which was to create a new and innovative way to implement our long-term defining innovation of affordable space exploration. And we actually launched a series of 3 initiatives, and they were reflected in the strategic focus elements of all the following years and the execution priorities. And one of those missions was to actually define a new area of space exploration, as it were, which was going to be in planetary defense, which was audacious. And I'll leave the reveal for later in the briefing. But the point is that we made a very specific decision that we implemented over a 10-year period of time that began with an outreach to the community. It began with building a constituency base, both internationally and nationally, with NASA and with Congress, and more importantly, with the scientific community, to prove that we could move beyond science fiction to actually building a system that had practical engineering possibilities in terms of planetary defense. So anyway, that's how the system would actually work. Okay, next slide, please. And from here, I would like to turn the briefing over to Dr. Jerry Quill and Dr. Brianna Vecchio-Pagan. Jerry's our Chief Technology Officer at the Applied Physics Laboratory, and Brianna is actually our Collaboration and Innovation Program Manager.
Thank you, Tim. I'm going to go ahead and tell the story of how we got our culture really kicked into high gear with innovation. First, for the staff, our director, Ralph Semmel, defined innovation as being different from invention. A lot of people were thinking it was one and the same. Inventions, whether it's ours or somebody else's, may be used to create an innovation. But an innovation is a new capability delivered and deemed useful to the user community. And as we've talked about, innovations that are game changers, such as satellite-based navigation, Ralph called defining innovations, and we sought those. Second, Ralph conveyed that everyone can be an innovative person, regardless of experience and work assignment. And then third, he empowered the line executives to fashion initiatives and experiments aligned with the strategy to practice and enhance our ability to innovate. So the team, through surveys, realized that certain aspects of our APL staff work environment needed to be adjusted to make innovation to a higher level. After reviewing hundreds of papers and articles about innovation, we settled on an article by Fayard and Weeks called "Who Moved My Cheese?" published in Harvard Review. That expressed the key aspects of innovation that we could easily explain and implement. They identified 3 P's: permission, proximity, and privacy, as needed for the innovation work environment. Our staff often did not feel permission to explore ideas, so we had a lot of rules and regulations. We greatly reduced the number of constraining rules and policies, and we celebrated that. So, for example, our director, Ralph Semmel, announced the end of the rule that no Frisbees can be played on the central lawn. And we all proceeded to go out and play Frisbee. We also began to greatly expand the number of collaboration and teaming spaces for staff to mingle and work in proximity to complement our already semi-private offices. Over time, we realized that there's really a 4th and a 5th P, perspective and performance. Research in our own experience has shown that team members with different perspectives are more likely to have novel solutions than team members with similar backgrounds. Also, our goal as a mission-oriented organization to achieve defining innovations led us to a performance metric, which is essentially impact or the potential for impact. In parallel with exploring these cultural attributes, we began to establish innovation initiatives. As expected, some of the innovations worked, some didn't, some worked with tweaking. Next slide, please. We began by challenging our staff with particularly difficult problems and a means to propose bold solutions and pursue them. The first such initiative we tried was what we called ignition grants, where the staff members proposed solutions to challenges and then voted on which proposals deserved to be funded. The staff expressed surprise that our management would trust their crowdsourced decisions, and it essentially sent them the message that they were empowered. Establishing ignition grants was considered to be a fleeting experiment that would then be replaced by something better. But the program has persisted as a staff favorite to this day. Other organizations, including our university parent, Johns Hopkins, have adopted the approach. Based on the success of ignition grants, we later added larger combustion grants and even bigger propulsion grants. All three grants comprise of a program we called Project Catalyst. Thus, we had a multi-stage approach from seedlings to prototypes and experiments. The technical challenges we pose require multidisciplinary approaches to solve, so they involve our fourth P, multiple perspectives. And the staff members are invited to form teams to propose bold bets and accelerate breakthroughs for our sponsors. Many new ideas were conceived and researched, and we identify their value by the potential they have for eventual impact, which invokes the fifth P, performance. And now, as Tim introduced, our program manager for innovation and collaboration, Dr. Brianna Vecchio Pagan, will discuss more of our innovation story.
Thank you, Jerry. All right, so I want to talk a little bit, if we can go to the next slide, or this slide, about skunkworks and what skunkworks have traditionally been. If everyone on the call is familiar, it's a concept that started at Lockheed Martin. It usually refers to a physically separated disruption center that empowers innovators in the organization to really push boundaries, right? But these skunkworks, they come with some challenges. Specifically in transitioning their work to business units in the organization. And that's because those business units are naturally going to be averse and have some friction there. They honestly don't like the surprise of being handed something that they had no part in developing. And really, if we think about the business units and kind of go back to that old adage, they're trying to make the horse faster. They're not thinking about inventing a car instead. So in the book, we present three options for implementing a virtual skunkworks. And this is having a higher probability of success transitioning those innovations to production potentially. So key takeaways here with the concept of a virtual skunkworks is having not really a physical space, but rather thinking about how you create that same type of environment within your business. So you need to align that experimentation that you are doing with a portion of the strategic needs from those business units that you have, and this gains buy-in. But you can also create buy-in by not having distinct staff that always work in the skunkworks setting. Rather, you have staff that are temporary or rotational from your existing business units. And this can be viewed very positively for them from a career progression standpoint. And again, helps create that awareness of what's happening within the skunkworks at any given time and allows them to socialize that out to the business units. So if you have a virtual skunkworks where you have staff coming from all those places in the organization to perform this transformative research on a time-limited scale, you may want to have a physical space for them to work during that period. You want that space to be agile and create the collisions or proximity needed for that big impactful work. Shown here in this image is actually our Innovation Center and Makerspace, which is also discussed in the book, which is known as Central Spark. So all staff are actually welcome in this space. It's great. It has 3D printers. It has all sorts of very creative opportunities, as well as just opportunities to socialize with other people. But it is often used by those staff that are working on innovation initiatives like those Jerry's just discussed, those grants, those diverse teams that are coming together. And we find that that space works really well for them. So we would suggest creating something like this, or at least having some dedicated space for those staff when they are in that kind of rotational period or going after those grants. Next slide. So we have a lot of creative tips in the book to improve performance of your innovation engine. And I want to spend a little bit of time on the top one, and Jerry touched on it for a minute. And this has really been key to the success of our organization. We assume that every single person at our lab can innovate. That is from the janitor who does get to vote on those technical projects that are put forward up to our top level executives. And that's if people are given the right conditions and resources, so those P's that were previously talked about. We think it's imperative for you to challenge your staff to do this, all of your staff, to innovate in all they do, right? Having this as a base level expectation for the entire company is very important, because even those small incremental innovations can add up to that big change that you want to see. And we say in here is, if anybody can innovate, why not everyone is innovating? Okay, so we've touched on some of these on the other slides. I'm not going to belabor them here, but they're in the book and we can take specific questions on them at the end. All right, I think I'm going to hand it back over to Tim.
We mentioned that when we did our retrospective look at and defined our organization's characteristic as innovation, and that we were innovative, we tried to define what that looked like, and we actually came up with a series of 9 historical examples. And those examples look something like inventing satellite navigation, not global positioning system, but a prior version that demonstrated that satellites could be used for navigation on the Earth. And the whole point of a defining innovation that story illustrates is it serves as an inflection point, either in the technology path or in society, perhaps, or if there's a particular area that your institution is renowned for, then the path, the arc of the technology progression along that path. So we had defined 9 of those, and then we proceeded to implement the strategy over the subsequent 15 years. But we were very careful not to just then assign key achievements or breakthroughs as defining innovations, because it really did take time to evaluate whether or not such an inflection point had actually occurred. And so we thought, notionally about 10 years so that we could measure impact. We could see what was actually going on. Now, no pun intended in talking about impact, but we actually launched the double asteroid redirection test on behalf of NASA in November 2024. And only a year later, we declared it to be a defining innovation. Well, how could that be? And the answer really lies in the description I provided earlier in the anecdote about trying to reinvigorate our mission design for NASA in order to provide just a kind of a replacement of some past missions. And one of those was that we were going to engage a very broad community, an international community, the scientific community, and the engineering community in order to prove that planetary defense was viable. And so this is an experiment. Why double asteroid? Because if we could hit the satellite, in this case Dimorphos, that was orbiting, it was a dual satellite that was orbiting Didymos, then we could measure the orbit of the satellite around the base asteroid. And so the whole experiment was designed as a kinetic impactor. There were a number of difficulties, and one of them was that we leveraged our guided missile technology in order to be able to target that satellite very precisely. But NASA had a threshold goal of 73 seconds of impact on the orbit around Dimorphos. I'm sorry, around Didymos. In point of fact, we actually changed the orbit with the impact by almost 30 minutes. And there was a follow-up mission that was actually launched by the European Space Agency a year later that went back and determined that we'd actually completely distorted the shape of the satellite, and broader measurements have subsequently proven in 2026 that we actually changed the orbit of the entire system around the sun. And so all that is to say, in a very practical way, we proved that we can redirect asteroids that were coming in at the Earth. All asteroids, not necessarily. NASA's still in the process of measuring them with another mission called NEO that came out of this entire process that we had implemented with NASA and the entire space community, including internationally. So what you see here is a 10-year effort that actually came to fruition in a particular mission that had 2 follow-on missions. And all of them have been really, by all measures, very successful. And so the claim to finding innovation is that we have proven that planetary defense is a viable path And now there's many practical steps to be followed in order to actually build the system if NASA and the government decide that that's necessary. But that's what a defining innovation looks like to us. Is that to say that you have to measure your success in such a way? No, that's something that you can decide for yourself in your own strategy. This is how APL chose to measure its success as a not-for-profit R&D laboratory. Okay, with that, then I will turn this over to Eric Johnson, who's the APL Chief of Staff, who's going to bring the presentation home.
Thank you, Tim. I was having some audio issues before, so can my fellow panelists give me a thumbs up if you can hear me okay? Can you all hear me?
We hear you fine. Yes, we hear you great.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be here with you all today. We certainly appreciate your interest and your time. So Chapter 11 in the book is dedicated to capturing some of the lessons we learned throughout this journey to become a fully strategy-driven organization. Like many lessons, these are not necessarily things that we realized in the moment, but rather they became clear over time and with the benefit of hindsight. So we thought we'd share a few of them here with you today. And of course, we could chat during the Q&A if you have questions on any of these. The next two slides offer a dozen lessons. I was prepared to discuss the ones in blue, and there are 5 of those. I think in the interest of leaving a little bit of time for questions, I'll probably just do 4 to leave some time for the Q&A. So we'll start with number 1, which came as a bit of a surprise to us and is somewhat counterintuitive. The traditional strategic planning approaches typically start with identifying a long-range vision and then letting that guide the details of the nearer-term objective setting and implementation phases. Certainly, if there's ample time to accommodate that approach, it's a perfectly logical way to go about it. But what we describe in the book is that APL found quite a bit of success with a more counterintuitive method. In our case, we implemented the annual strategy cycle before developing the long-range vision. And now, as a bit of context, at the time we were embarking on this new strategy development effort, APL was facing a rather dynamic environment that included some potential funding disruptions, as well as some distinct national security challenges that we needed to respond to as a Department of Defense focused R&D laboratory. Now, this dynamic and uncertain environment prompted us to start by implementing the annual strategy cycle that Tim described first. And there were 2 advantages that we found to that approach. The first is that it enabled the new director and the executive team to very quickly establish some new strategic priorities to address and react to some of those external pressures that we were feeling. The second is that it helped the leadership team establish both a cadence and a discipline for taking on strategy at the enterprise level. And that discipline and experience really proved quite valuable as the executives subsequently focused on developing strategies within their respective business and service units around the laboratory. And the final thing I'll say there is that the experiences from rolling out that annual cycle first also helped to inform the executives when it came time to develop that longer-term vision to complement the strategy. So I think the takeaway here is the phases of long-term vision setting and shorter-term annual planning and implementation cycles are both important, but the timing and the sequencing can be somewhat flexible. And certainly our experience tells us that there's value to that more counterintuitive approach. So let's jump to number 4. Strategy for innovation can and should be an exciting and substantive journey that must involve the staff members themselves in experimentation to determine what works for the organization. So it's probably not surprising that strategic thinkers don't just exist at the executive levels. They're scattered throughout an organization at all levels. It's also not particularly a novel idea that engaging and gathering inputs from staff members are valuable initiatives because they can surface some great ideas and they can help build buy-in within the organization. In our case, we typically look to engage our staff in ways that can help us define potential strategic vectors or directions and help us to experiment along the way. So an example approach that worked really well here at APL involved standing up 3 teams of high potential leaders within the organization from around the organization. They were each given a clean sheet of paper and very few constraints, and they were tasked by our Chief Strategy Officer, Tim Galpin, at the time, with developing some bold ideas to help shape the laboratory's strategy and future. Conceivably, these could become strategic focus areas for the strategy. The chief strategy officer served as an advisor for each team, and the teams worked independently and somewhat competitively, although competition was not a formal part of the experiment. And then the teams, once they had pulled their ideas together, had the opportunity to pitch them to the executive council as part of our annual strategy formulation process. And I'll tell you that having participated as a team member in one of those first cohorts when we stood them up, I can tell you this worked well from all sides. It was a great opportunity, a great development opportunity for the participants who were also motivated by the chance to contribute to the laboratory's broader strategy. And there were a number of terrific ideas that were eventually adopted by the Executive Council as strategic focus areas. You heard Brianna talk, Jerry and Brianna talk about the value of experimentation a few slides ago, so I won't belabor that here, other than to note that the wildly successful Central Spark activity that Brianna mentioned actually began as a staff idea and as a staff championed experiment that a lot of folks at the laboratory didn't think would succeed, but as Brianna mentioned, it's been wildly successful. Okay, let's jump to number 6. If you've paid much attention to strategic planning initiatives over time and across organizations, it probably comes as no surprise that strategic plan implementations generally do not have a great track record. And Ron mentioned some of those statistics earlier. It's not uncommon that they fail, and despite the best of intentions, they can fail for any number of reasons. We cite some study statistics in the book from the Bridges consultancy that highlight the failure rates. Ron mentioned some earlier. And they point out that both poor communication and a lack of leadership are among the top 3 reasons for failed strategy implementation. So our takeaway here, and the lesson is probably not too surprising in that context, the key to making the entire organization strategy driven is the CEO's visible commitment to following the strategy by intentionally connecting every major decision back to that vision and strategy. So investments in research development, facilities, and people all must relate to some aspect of that vision and strategy, and they must be explicitly aligned with the organization's core purpose and core values. So in other words, the strategy driven really means that the strategy matters to everyone within the organization. So direct and ongoing communications from the CEO are vital to impress on the whole staff that strategy is important and top of mind for the executive team. And the CEO also needs to take every opportunity to take the strategy and the vision directly to the entire staff, both in formal and informal venues. So at APL, the director personally delivers a strategy-oriented address to the entire staff every year in a 1-hour event. The event's largely in person, but it's also available online and recorded so that people can watch afterwards if they're not able to make the event. But in summary, these cumulative communications and the events really reinforce the lab's commitment to the vision, and they ultimately make each staff member's connection to the strategy clearer and clearer. I'm going to skip over number 10. We're on to the next slide here. I'm going to skip over number 10 and finish up with number 12. We offer this one as a caution against setting an explicit strategic goal to change the culture. Culture adapts and evolves as an organization fulfills its mission and its vision, not because it's called out as a strategic objective. Excuse me. I'll provide a less eloquent version of something our prior director used to say: if you focus on the right things, the right culture will emerge. So we believe it's not necessary and could actually be counterproductive to set strategic objectives for attributes of a desired culture change or mandate a change in the organization's culture. While we at APL set out to infuse innovation in all that we do, we didn't try to specify which associated changes in values or practices or behaviors would go along with it. Rather, a culture that's supportive of innovation emerged as we took on challenges that required creative approaches and multidisciplinary um, staff members engaging on them. And the workforce felt empowered to seek bold solutions and take risks in their work, which also contributed. Over time, the staff culture just kind of became more innovative because the challenges and the opportunities for innovation invited it. And the last thing I'll say, the other downside of attempting to explicitly change the culture is that it causes the defenses to go up around the organization, particularly for successful and long-standing organizations. You'll hear pushback like, what's wrong with our culture? It's served us well to this point, so why do we need to change it now? So in short, you know, it really creates an unnecessary obstacle on a lot of negative inertia that will impede progress in a strategy setting. So those are our lessons from a years-long journey to become a strategy-driven organization. Hope you find them helpful, and as I mentioned, we can cover any questions during the Q&A portion. I'm going to kick it back to Ron Newman to finish this out. Ron, I think you're muted.
We haven't had opportunity to talk about all the material in the book. These 6 bullets here summarize what the other major topics are. The first 3 are standalone chapters that provide important how-to information for adoption and adaptation to your own organization's particular challenges and market sector. The 4th measures results and traces some notable innovations that directly resulted from the systems approach to strategy, just like the DART one that Tim mentioned. And then, of course, the last 2 just give more background to the national R&D landscape that might be unfamiliar to other folks. So, Vaishali, that's it. We can try to do some Q&A at this point.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I just want to start off first by thanking all of our presenters today. That was excellent. A lot of insights gained. And I appreciate you hosting and participating in this webinar for IEEE Press. And also, I've been looking at the chat and I saw questions coming in, and thank you also for responding to those as they came in and having a dialogue with our attendees, which is really beneficial for everybody. So I just had a few questions I wanted to pose to you. Of course, anybody who has any other questions can send them in via the chat at any time. But let's get started with a question about the methodology and how it applies or doesn't apply for profit companies. Would it be applicable to for-profit companies in the same way?
Yeah, I could take that one on. We actually got that question from several of the reviewers as the manuscript was being written, and I think, and that is essentially what they'd say, since their approach has really only been fully wrung out in a nonprofit organization, how do you know that how can you be sure it's applicable to the broader business community? Well, that was actually pretty surprising to us. If you go back to that diagram that Tim worked through with the cycle, the annual cycle, and the innovation initiatives around it, all 6 elements of that integrated system are based firmly on research and experience in the for-profit sector. And so it stands to reason to us that when the elements are integrated, that foundation is not disturbed at all. So as was mentioned, the long-range vision, core values, and purpose framework, that's from Collins and Forrest and Great by Choice. The VSE approach, strategy on one page, that's from Cisco, a renowned IT firm. Aligning resources with strategy and regular reviews for accountability, that's standard practice in business, and Menken's article from Harvard Business Review emphasizes that. Strategic decision making is from Menken's and Steele, and a long study on many businesses about strategic decision in the first place as to what are strategic issues, and then tackling them in a particular method. That's all based on industry. And as Jerry mentioned, the innovation prerequisites model and many innovation papers are based on industry. So actually, a better question, frankly, from our perspective, is why would we have proceeded to apply this approach in a laboratory setting when the elements had only been studied in the for-profit sector? So, so that then the answer to that is that when you dig down into the implementation on these half a dozen different wrung out methods from industry, they can be, the objectives and the strategy can be, you know, financial objectives, or they can be impact objectives. And so so anyway, that question, or that better question, is why you know, why would it work in a nonprofit? That actually motivated Collins to write a supplement to Good to Great for the social sectors, and show how you could slip in more altruistic, if you will, objectives and strategies in the same sort of framework. So
Yes.
anyway, that's the long answer to that one.
Yeah, thank you, Ron. That makes sense to me. Another question that I see coming in is about innovative thinking. And I think that's an interesting one, right? Because the proposer is asking, time card reporting accountability allows little time for other innovative thinking. So how do you get the discretionary funding to foster innovation? I mean, it's also a question about how do you get staff to innovate at all levels? So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Jerry or Tim?
Well, in terms of the funding, we have internal investment money, and most organizations do. And that is the basis for a lot of our innovation of potential products of our main business. But when everybody's feeling that they can innovate in all that they do, and it doesn't require them to be inventors, it's creative thinking and working together. It just, as pointed out, learning by doing really raised all the boats, in my view. We started with ignition grants, and we were getting hundreds of really good ideas that we never heard of before, and many of those went on. So there's also an aspect of volunteerism. Central Spark is open 24/7, and people can work on their own time.
That's an interesting point. Anybody else want to chip in, or?
But I just make the observation that this idea that you're somehow restricted from innovative thinking because you have a time charge that you're charging to some particular code, I think is really sort of a fundamental misunderstanding. You know, most of these folks are non-exempt employees. They're paid a salary to think and solve problems. So they're certainly allowed to think and solve problems on the budget that they're working on, because all of that's going to eventually contribute to, you know, solving the lab's problems. Now, I'm not one to speak to everybody's individual time card issues, but I do think there's plenty of room in the day to have innovative thoughts, and we've had a lot of people prove that they can do that and still execute on their current tasks.
Good point. Good point.
Can I weigh in on that one as well?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Vashimi. I think it's a good observation. You know, as federal contractors, we're required to record our hours worked pretty closely, and we actually had an issue here at the laboratory where there was that perception that people thought, staff members believed that they needed to innovate, you know, kind of on budgets other than their direct budgets, you know, the things that they were doing directly for sponsors. And that's something we kind of had to work really hard. You know, the innovation and all we do is one outcome of that, trying to convince them that, you know, innovation is something we're looking for regardless of what task you're working on, as Tim just brought up. It's not something you do when you're not doing your regular work. So that was really something we had to kind of nip in the bud within the organization before that belief became too ingrained. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, when you talk about innovation, right, like, yeah, you want to have people innovating at all levels, but there's a follow-up question to that too, right? how do you measure whether that culture is actually taking hold? Do you have any insights into how do you measure whether that's happening or not?
I think Brianna has some ideas. It's written
Mhm.
about that.
Yeah, we have a very extensive list of metrics in the book and kind of when to implement those and when to measure them. There's a variety. Culture is one thing, right? Measuring your culture is something else, and there's a lot of different ways that you can do that through surveys, et cetera, and compare that with outside companies. But for us, culture is not the endpoint, right? So outcomes are the endpoint. So your culture will eventually meet where you're trying to get with your outcomes if you're achieving your outcomes, right? So that being said, again, I would check out the book. We do have a number of metrics that you can look at on the scale of innovation from, base level culture type of things all the way to outcomes. Yeah.
Perfect. There's another question that came up about whether this approach is agnostic to the work environment. Like, what about remote and hybrid work environments, and how do they affect the ability of an organization when it comes to innovation? And can these methods be modified or applied in this type of work environment, or is it agnostic to the kind of work environment you have? Brianna,
Take that one.
go ahead. Yes, please go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah. So we do have a section looking at, hybrid work, remote work, and kind of implementation in those spaces. It's very unique, obviously, following the pandemic. We do have a portion of our staff that, work from home, at least for a portion of their time. We really focused on creating a robust digital workplace environment where we share information at the same level that we do on campus, in person, et cetera, or try to convey that information as best we can to our individuals who may not be on campus that day or may be remotely working. And I think that's really important to not neglect that. And when you're setting up a digital infrastructure, thinking very, very distinctly about how those tools are going to intersect with your strategy and help support your strategy distinctly.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Any thoughts, still again on the innovation side, but any thoughts on how long it takes to begin to see the results from innovation incentive programs, for instance? Maybe Jerry, you have some thoughts on that?
So, as I said earlier, we started some innovation experiments, and we were surprised how quickly we were getting ideas that were really, really good and potentially of value to our sponsors. It turned out that our staff had a lot of pent-up ideas and no place to send them. And so we essentially we realized we opened the floodgates. And that has not abated. It actually has grown, and as Tim pointed out with some of the defining innovations that are future ones that are bubbling up now, it's essentially changed us in a way that's not going backwards. It's going forward.
That's very good to know.
But Shelley, I might point out, though, that it really depends on the nature of your organization. If you really are fundamentally innovative and then somehow the staff or the engineers and scientists have been blocked and stymied, you can release those floodgates pretty quickly, and you can start to see the results very quickly in terms of the current funded work as well as the new initiatives. But if you are a process-bound, hidebound institution that shuts down innovation, the CEO standing on a stage saying we're going to be innovative now isn't going to help you any at all. You're going to have to. It's be a long, involved process to actually, change where you are, because cultures change very, very slowly.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Maybe Tim, I can stay with you for a second there, because I am curious about whether this approach, how it affects costs. Like, does implementation of this approach, like the approach that you implemented, did it affect your costs or increase your costs in any way?
Yeah, I think it's really important for everybody to understand that the essence of the strategy and the resource allocation is to make decisions about resources. So no, does not have to increase cost. Now,
okay.
I think that's the lesson I want you to take away. You could make a strategic decision to move in a completely new area and to resource it. I mean, you could certainly say, yes, we are going to make a decision to invest more in basic research and development. So we're going to put more money into that. But if you are budget constrained, and it's certainly that's true in most organizations, then the proper way to do that is to first see whether or not that means that there's something else you should stop resourcing and move those resources over. And that's more or less what we did. We set what our budgets were going to be. We didn't seek to increase them. We held that line through each of the budgeting cycles. And in many cases, we were able to actually reduce costs because the ideas were so good they were picked up for funding and they led to new business. So, but absolutely does not need to increase costs. You just have to make hard decisions and stick to them.
Perfect. Thank you. We do have more questions coming in, and I see that you're responding to them. So thank you so much for doing that. We are 6 minutes over, so I do want to wrap up maybe with the final question here about strategy and the long-term vision and, having a different approach to strategy. So what would you say are the advantages to beginning with a near and midterm strategy rather than a long-term vision? Ron, Tim, yeah.
I'll jump in and then others can speak. But the value of starting with the mid and near term strategy is it's practical and you can, and people will understand it in the current context, and you can really get after those very precise and measurable objectives, and then you can resource them and you can evaluate whether or not you achieve them. And as that's going on, then it buys you 1 to 3 years where you can continue thinking through whatever your long-term approach is. Because remember, all of these institutions that we're talking about, they have a business approach already. And unless it really needs to radically change, it's worth taking time to think through where you're going in the long term versus where you've been in the long term. And meanwhile, have that near-term and short-term strategy where you can have very practical results to prove to yourself that the process works.
Yeah, and if you get started early on 3-year kinds of things, 5-year kinds of objectives, and the staff starts to see progress, and they see decisions that are made that are aligned with the strategy, and they know it's the real thing. They can't outlast it. They can't wait for a 20-year strategy and everybody says, oh yeah, we're working on it. But if you get uptight, and then move, as Tim says, move the resources around aggressively, people take notice and they want to be part of it.
Okay, thank you. With that, I do want to bring us to the end of the webinar. I would again like to thank all our presenters for the day, for their excellent presentations and insights, and everyone who took the time to come and attend. Again, a reminder, yes, of course, that you do get a discount for purchasing the book as a webinar registrant. And we will be sending a follow-up email to all registrants soon with the recording. And thank you again.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Very good. Thanks a lot for organizing this.
Absolutely.